wore steel-toe boots. I carried weapons, sometimes pepper spray, batons.
We were estimating well over 200, if not closer to 300 active groups in the Canadian context.
I went from powerless to powerful virtually overnight. I went from being bullied and beaten and abused to feeling like I'm the bully now and I have power.
It's really hard to ask your citizens to not be racist when your own laws still differentiate and keep a group of people under your thumb.
Canada. Diversity, freedom, and celebration. Canada welcomes all and treats everyone the same. Right?
Columbus came into this country saying he was coming peaceful. They say they're coming into the country peaceful when they're not.
Got a message?
It just goes to show we come trying to be peaceful, and then they bring the violence.
Does Canada's own behavior give space to hate and bigotry?
Oh, you don't even know me, man. You don't know what I've done for the world.
White supremacist piece of shit.
Okay, and then when you check me up online, you're going to find out some stuff.
What's your name?
Totally.
What's your name?
You're both stopping here. You're obstructing us now.
Hate comes in many forms. Microaggressions, like being followed by security. And worse.
Anyone who was visibly not white ended up getting it. The fact is that I was pretty violent, or very violent, throughout my time on the street and my involvement in the white supremacist movement.
Dan Gallant is a father, an outdoorsman, a lawyer. But rage was a part of his life early on.
The hatred that I felt started when I was quite young. Prior to drugs and alcohol, I had tried to commit suicide. I was 12 years old, I believe. It was my first institutionalization as a result of that at a young age. And that directly stemmed from domestic abuse that I witnessed, watching my mom get beaten, raped.
He moved to West Moberly First Nation around 1987 and often stayed with his cookum near Soto First Nation.
And to be honest, up to that point, I went to the reserve to live with my grandma. That's where I felt at home, and that's where I felt safe. Yeah, Moberly Lake. There's two reserves.
Gallant believed his father was Indigenous until a DNA test about 10 years ago.
And I lived mostly on Soto.
The test revealed he was not blood related, but he is still part of that community.
So I've always known her as Grandma.
The Soto First Nation even contributed to his law school tuition.
When I was 11.
As a young teen, he was part of an Indigenous community.
My first swastika tattoo was an anti-swastika tattoo. It was a swastika with a bullet hole for anti-racism that was done on an old Métis settlement.
Fighting became routine for him living in northern BC.
And I got quite sick of it. I ended up leaving the North and going back down to East Van.
His recruitment was from a chance encounter.
When I was on the street, I met this long-haired dude who was white power. And he actually disclosed to me that he was half Aboriginal. So me and him connected because we're both from the same area and both have somewhat similar stories. I was introduced to this whole doctrine that explained who to hate and why. It was about hating the people that were running the system, the capitalist system, who were all Jews.
Transferring that rage to the white supremacist movement was a natural move.
It became really easy to justify hurting people. I then started taking on this identity that I was fighting against our society, fighting against our government, fighting against this Jewish supremacism that I believed was going on. And it was real easy for me to jump ship from being a part of the First Nations community where I lived into what I was going into because I was white.
He first joined a group called the World Church of the Creator.
It was founded by a guy from Saskatchewan who was a Mennonite who ended up going to the U.S. and rejecting his religion, and he established a white supremacist religion based on what he called nature's eternal religion, which was the might is right, that whoever trumps through violence wins, and very Nazi-esque.
Things took a more violent turn as he got deeper into the group.
At one point, I ended up dedicating myself to committing violence every day for a year, and that continued on past at the time I was counting, and the most amount of assaults and fights in a day was 9. I usually had pretty swollen hands. I wore steel-toe boots. I carried weapons, sometimes pepper spray, batons. At different times I wore heavy rings with sharp objects on the rings.
Well, we can just talk about what we're doing. So,
Dr. Barbara Perry is the director of the Center of Hate, Bias and Extremism. She works extensively on right-wing extremism in Canada and has identified more than 100 active groups.
So we published our first study of the far right, what we call an environmental scan. It's the first academic and comprehensive examination of the far right in Canada.
And she says that number doubled or tripled just 4 years later.
We're on sort of the second round of the updating of that study, and we were estimating well over 200, if not closer to 300 active groups in the Canadian context. What we're seeing more of is the groups are fragmenting, and so we're seeing an atomization where we're seeing more lone actors, more individuals who might be informed by these groups.
Perry sees white supremacy across Canada, though it's mostly associated with our neighbors south of the border.
Well, I mean, North America generally is a white settler, culture, whether we're talking about Canada or whether we're talking about the U.S. So there's always been, it's always been imbued with, racial superiority and white supremacy.
Gallant left the movement more than 20 years ago. He now practices law in Prince George, BC. He now helps people who also want to leave. For Gallant, that mission is personal and much needed. He says if he can do it, anyone can.
That place where I would get to when I was so angry that I would, looking back, call it disassociate and just hurt people. That's the action of hate and rage. When looking at just the feeling of hatred is just that pushing away and lashing out at anything that is different, but not only different, things that are also the same as I am. But that took a lot of digging to get to that realization.
But for advocates like Dr. Cindy Blackstock, Canada has always been racist.
On February 23rd, it'll actually be the 13th anniversary of the case. And we're still going at it in terms of having to litigate against Canada to bring them into compliance. Canada's unwilling to adopt the Spirit Bear Plan and get an independent evaluation of itself so that we understand why Canada doesn't do better for First Nations children when it knows better, and actually put a stop to this horrendous cycle of discrimination that's now affected countless generations of First Nations kids, going back from residential schools to the 60 scoop to our case right now. We have to figure out what it is in that department that makes them a repeat offender and get them to stop.
We'll have that coming up next.
So maybe somebody's...
We have a system based on white supremacy, that's founded on white supremacy, and continues the effects of white supremacy and continues racist law. It's hard. I'm not the Prime Minister, but I imagine it's really hard to ask your citizens to not be racist when your own laws still differentiate and keep a group of people under your thumb, under the government's thumb, just simply based on their race, as the group of people that were here, Indigenous people.
Maybe it's Canada itself.
We see the work of Cindy Blackstock and what she's done with human rights in the name of Indigenous children who are in care. These are the things that evidence to me that the white supremacist system is still in motion.
Canada's racism has been at the center of Cindy Blackstock's work for decades, and it's apparent on both sides of the political spectrum in this country, not just the extreme right.
I cannot even find a word in my vocabulary to tell you how shocked I am to stand here today.
Her group, the First Nations Caring Society, brought the Government of Canada to court and to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal over unequal treatment of Indigenous kids in the child welfare system.
While they ask our kids to be patient, our kids are dying. It says to me how deep it is. And I think that's what I've been stunned about during the entire case. Because they've known that what they're doing was unequal. They've known the harms to kids. Even their own expert that they were going to call for the tribunal as a witness disagreed with them and sided with us on the inequality. And even then they kept fighting. It just shows to me that the department, as part of its DNA, has this culture of discrimination and continues to legitimize it.
Blackstock points to the fact that Canada's Liberal government has spent millions fighting the rights of First Nation children in court, something she says sends a message.
And we see this pattern of kind of willful negligence playing out also in the 60 scoop. And then we have the tribunal finding Canada to be willful and reckless in its discrimination. And what that really boils down to in lay terms is that Canada intended to do this. They had the resources and the knowledge to make the discrimination stop, and at every turn they chose to continue it.
Let's be clear. Even before Canada became a country, discriminatory law was part of its DNA. In the 15th century, the Doctrine of Discovery said only Christians could claim territory. As Turtle Island got dissected into colonies, Canada became a country in 1867. Canada's first Prime Minister said he had to deal with an Indian problem and created residential schools and reserves. First Nations were segregated from the settler population, and, occasionally, so were Eastern Europeans and Asians. Racist theory was accepted in academics until the 1950s, when it was formally denounced by the United Nations. The last residential school shut down in 1996. In 2007, the federal government was found to be discriminating against First Nation children and told to stop. It hasn't.
So I think that Canada, if it wants to set an example that forms of extremism, forms of discrimination are wrong, and that nobody in the population, either as an individual or group, should be perpetrating that type of disgraceful conduct, then itself, they should be stopping that behavior. They should not be saying, oh, well, everybody stop discriminating, it's bad, but don't look over here because we're doing it. That can't be the message. I don't think Canada's in any position to reform child welfare until it reforms itself. It needs to stop its own discriminatory attitudes.
The U.S. is often pointed out as the site of real far-right extremism. But Canada has its own history. One that Elisa Hadigan actively participated in.
I came upon the Heritage Front because I saw a guy on TV talking about being proud of your European heritage. And he was in a suit, he didn't look like a skinhead, and I wrote to him, and then I got the information for the Heritage Front. The Heritage Front had a hotline at the time. And the hotline just had basic messages like, you know, there's nothing wrong with being proud of your heritage.
She became the face of the group, young and female.
And I left a message on that hotline after a few days of listening. And within 24 hours, the leader of the Heritage Front, Wolfgang Droge, called me back right away.
Droge was the notorious leader of the front. He was shot to death in 2005. For Hadigan, the front became a place where she could belong.
I came to Canada from communist Romania when I was 11. My family was very abusive and dysfunctional, and by 16, my father had died, and I'd ran away from home. I went through CAS and group homes and ended up back at my mother's house. I had dropped out of school in grade 9, and here I am at 16. I have no friends, no sense of belonging. I don't feel like I'm Canadian. I'm not Romanian anymore.
She gave speeches across North America.
Within a month, I was speaking at rallies and being groomed to become the poster child of the organization. I was still 16. By 17, they had forged consent papers, and I was speaking, representing Canada's far right and the Heritage Front on the Montel Williams show in New York. The progression was very rapid. I went from powerless to powerful virtually overnight. I went from being bullied and beaten and abused to feeling like I'm the bully now and I have power.
She understands why people gravitate towards far-right movements.
They seemed normal people. Like Ernst was like a grandfather to me. Wolfgang became my father figure after my father died.
Close ties that led to other suggestions.
Because I'm the face of the Heritage Front and I'm a speaker and all of this, they wanted me to have Aryan babies and you know, date some of the other guys, and I refused. And when people started getting harassed and beaten in the streets, and then when I was actually asked by the second leader of the Heritage Front, Grant Bristow, to harass an activist because she was a lesbian, I had to confront the fact that I was gay, and I was kind of coming to terms with that. That's when I knew that I couldn't be in this organization.
After an attempt at self-harm, she met with a woman she was supposed to harass and made a plan.
And then I said to her, it would be a waste if I leave now. I'm in too deep. I know a lot. So let me try to help to shut them down. So she put me in touch with an anti-racist organization in Montreal.
She eventually left the movement and wrote about her experiences. She left on her own, but not before collecting evidence for prosecutors against the Heritage Front.
Over a period of 4 months, I spied on the Heritage Front and Ernst. I gathered a lot of information on illegal activities, weapons, harassment, terror campaign, and we put together about 30 affidavits that we presented to the OPP. And eventually, my cover was blown and I was on the run. And I ended up coming back into Toronto and testifying a year later against Wolfgang and 2 other members of the Heritage Front. They were convicted and they spent a few months in jail.
And it's not as though Canada's far-right history is in the distant past.
The alt-right isn't on the rise because it's always been here. White supremacy and racism has always been part of Western society and North America. So there's nothing that suddenly happened last year because Trump got elected or because of Charlottesville. It's always been here. What's on the rise now is the mainstreaming of these racist conversations.
And online, it's booming. Coming up next week on APTN Investigates, we speak to the reporter who broke the story of the year.